Good morning there, and welcome. You might have noticed, or maybe you didn't, but during the last few weeks, or couple of weeks, the Sunday readings have jumped from the usual Mark at this time of the year into John, and specifically chapter 6 of John. And what I want to do this morning is to share a little reflection on this chapter, but with a particular focus that I believe John, the evangelist, is trying to make when he records Jesus' words about the bread of life. And the chapter begins with John saying, Passover was near. And Passover, as you remember, is that meal that the Jews celebrate every year, remembering their liberation from slavery and begin the process towards the promised land. And Jesus, like a good Jew, celebrated that every year. And the last time he celebrated was the night before he was crucified, and 3 days before he was raised to new life. And so what I'm going to do today is to try and share a little bit of what we mean by the Eucharist as a meal. And as I've just said, we go back to John's Gospel, and I hope to be somewhat faithful to that with my limited abilities. Passover was near, and the chapter begins with Jesus having compassion on the crowds who were looking for him, has compassion on them because they are hungry, and he feeds them. Literally feeds them. He multiplies, by whatever way it was, the few breads they had between them, 5 loaves. And 5,000 people eat. And are more than eat, they are more than satisfied. And that's how the chapter begins. Then Jesus leaves the crowd and goes back to Capernaum. But the crowds follow in other boats, and they get there and they find Jesus. And there in the synagogue, he begins to tell them all about what they can anticipate with the bread of life. And he says several things. I am the bread of life. The bread I give comes down from heaven. And they protest. They say, but Moses gave us bread in the desert. And Jesus says, it wasn't Moses who gave you the bread in the desert, the manna. It was my Father. And my Father will continue to give you bread. Bread that is life. And the bread I give you is for the life of the world. And the bread I give you is true food. And the wine I give you is true drink. And those who eat this bread and drink this wine will be in me and I in them. Jesus identifies personally, intimately, with the bread that is shared. And that bread, as we remember, was in the Eucharist. And so when we look at the Eucharist, we look at the Last Supper. It was a memorial meal. The Jews, and in this case Jesus and his disciples, remembered and made present their liberation from slavery. Because on the night before they set off from Egypt and scampered across the Red Sea into the desert and total freedom, they celebrated a special meal wherein, gathered as a family, they sacrificed a lamb, each family, and prepared it. They also had bread, but there wasn't time for the bread to raise. It was flat. It was without leaven. And this gave them nourishment, gave them strength for the journey. And the Jews remembered that every year, and they still do. Every Passover, which is the same time as our Easter, we follow their calendar for Easter. they gather and in families and celebrate a special meal, making present that liberation from slavery. And Jesus, as a good Jew, did the same thing. As we know, he sat at the table with his disciples and he shared a meal. The difference there was that Jesus said, I am the lamb. I am the sacrifice. I am the nourishment. And in the Eucharist, Jesus becomes the bread that we all share. And so it is today. We do the same thing in the Mass, as we've done for 2,000 years. So that we gather around the table of the Eucharist, and we share, and we are nourished, and we remember, and we give thanks. And we are better people for it. And that's why we have the big change in the Church since just before Vatican II. In 1962 that began, so in the late 50s, the early 60s, when there was a reform of the liturgy. And the altar, which had been up against the back wall of the church, many of you won't remember that, of course. I do. But that altar was there, and the priest had his back to the people. But then to retake and to re-appreciate and to live the Eucharist as meal, the altar was brought forward and was made a table. And we all, as the family of God, the Catholic family, in a specific location or affiliation, gather around that altar, that table, and share the bread of life, which, as we know, is Jesus himself. So John captured that in his Gospels, and we'll hear it in the next few Sundays as well. John was trying to be faithful to the teachings of Jesus about the bread of life. And Jesus was being faithful to his Jewish tradition. 1,200 years before was the liberation from slavery, right up to now. And then we do the same thing today, remembering, making present what Jesus did for us at the Last Supper and on Calvary. So there it is. One of the aspects of Mass, of the Eucharist today, is it's a meal. And I think it's rather important that we appreciate that we are nourished as we give thanks, as a family, gather around the table of the Eucharist. Thanks. Have a good week, and God bless.